Welcome back to GB News Live. Now, the latest on the tanks being sent to Ukraine. President Zelensky now urging Western allies for a speedy delivery of that armour that was promised yesterday. Of course, Germany announcing they'll be sending 14 of the Leopard 2s to the battleground and releasing others from Poland and so on. The United States saying eventually 31 M1 Abrams tanks going to help them try and keep the Russians at bay. But Russia itself, well, it's condemned the announcement, saying it's a provocation and that any tanks that would be sent would be burning, as they said. Well, let's get now the views of General Lord Richard Dannatt, both former Chief of the General Staff and former Head of the British Army. To Lord Dannatt, thanks very much for your time. Of course, you will have been familiar with the wargaming of the Cold War and the Russian tanks coming across the borders, the T-72s and so on. Is that what they fear may happen in this spring offensive the Russians could launch?
Well, it's almost inevitable that in the cycle of this war, and let's just not forget, it's totally immoral, this war. It's Russian aggression in absolute spades. But given where we are, and the Russians have gone through a mobilization exercise and put a large number of additional troops onto the battlefield, it's almost inevitable that probably at some stage in the late winter, early spring, the Russians will make a new offensive.
Yeah, a lot of people might be thinking, you know, given what happened last time, is tank warfare really where the focus could be? Because so many of the Russian armament was knocked out pretty quickly, and one thinks maybe, you know, should it be air defence and planes in the sky that were a better option?
Well, OK, if you'd just like me to make a slightly longer point, my point is that the Russians will make another offensive on the ground in the late winter, early spring. But on the evidence of what we've seen, that's almost inevitably going to fail, because although they'll put some armour up front, their armour is very subject to the anti-tank weapons that the West has provided. So they'll rely heavily on massed artillery and infantry attacks. So yes, so the previous packages that the West has given to Ukraine to increase their air defence capabilities, the Patriot missile systems, terribly important, that we were talking about a month or two ago, that will actually help protect. That will help protect Ukraine. But the key point here, and this is the really key point about tanks, is that we now need to give, and we are giving, the Ukrainians an offensive capability that when the Russians have spent themselves in this inevitable attack that they're going to make again, then the Ukrainians can mount a counter-offensive that can be really successful and potentially break the spirit of the Russian soldier and break the back of the Russian army. That's what's got to happen, because this war is not going to be settled by negotiation. It'll be settled on the battlefield.
Have we left it a bit late? Because, of course, it's not just getting the armour there. The crews will have to be trained. And we've got quite varying bits of kit, the Challenger, the Leopard, and then eventually the Abrams as well. And, of course, all the supply lines and maintenance as well.
Yes, of course, it would have been better, it would have been different if these decisions and discussions had taken place 2 or 3 months ago, so that we were further advanced. But when an army is at war, as the Ukrainians are, and the people of Ukraine are, a lot can happen in a quite short period of time. And now that the decision has been made by various Western nations to supply not just tanks, but armoured infantry fighting vehicles, self-propelled artillery, these equipments are being trained on now by Ukrainian soldiers, and that when the time comes, sometime in the late winter, early spring or mid-spring, they will be ready to mount a counter-offensive. And there's one thing actually we've got to be quite careful about now, is that if we speculate too much on the numbers of equipments that the Ukrainians will have, the capability that they will have, we run the risk of compromising whatever operational surprise they might be able to achieve over the Russians. So I think in our reporting and discussion and analysis of these things, we want to become fairly measured in the next few days, weeks and months.
Right. Accepting that, one assumes the Russians would think the Ukrainians will make an effort to retake Crimea.
Well, they can think that. I think physically retaking Crimea will be pretty difficult. I think what is more likely to be the outcome of a successful Ukrainian counter-offensive in, let's just say, the spring, sooner or later, who knows, that the outcome of a successful Ukrainian counter-offensive is that actually the Russian army will be defeated. And having been defeated, I think we will see a change of leadership in the Kremlin, and it's in those circumstances that we would see Russia giving up Crimea. I can't foresee how practically and physically the Ukrainians will be able to free themselves or free their territory in eastern Ukraine and then kick across to Crimea.
Right.
The Ukrainians will get control of Crimea when the Russians have decided that they're going to withdraw and give it up.
And last thought, what level of defeat do you think will finally persuade others, perhaps in the Kremlin, to move against Putin, or Putin himself to realise the game is no longer worth the candle?
Well, there are several groups of people who don't agree with what Putin is doing. There are the ultranationalists who don't disagree with the war, but they disagree with the way that he's been fighting the war. The senior military are completely fed up to the back teeth at the way that Putin has taken them into this war, his interference in their command decisions, the reality that their weapons are inferior to the West because of the corruption in their procurement process. I could see General Gerasimov, the Chief of General Staff, him being the leader of a coup against Putin and establishing a different regime in the Kremlin. And let's face it, if they want to get their economy back on its feet, if they want to restore trading relations with the West, they've got to get rid of this ridiculous notion that they can push out the influence of Russia back into western parts of Europe in the way that Putin, in his rather ridiculously historically related view, seems to think that he can. The Russian people will do much better when they've got rid of Vladimir Putin.